buenos días a todos. Es un honor para mí estar con ustedes hoy. Con su permiso, voy a hablar en inglés because otherwise you'll have a 5 Tylenol headache with my English. So this is a very difficult place to be. After the Secretario, who's brilliant, by the way, the future of Mexico is in this generation and your generation. And having Hank Paulson come in later in the afternoon, I feel like a piece of bacon between 2 pancakes. It's a little bit difficult. So what I'm going to do is give you the dessert, and I'm going to let Hank Paulson, who is the best Secretary of the Treasury the United States has ever had, speak to you this afternoon. And if any of you have not read his book, On the Brink, you need to do so. It's just an amazing adventure of how he almost uniquely saved the world from what could have been an incredible global crisis. So what I'd like to do, I've prepared a presentation which I'm now going to throw away because there's nothing left for me to say after the Secretary and Hank Paulson. There's plenty of information. What I'm going to do is divide my talk to you into 2 pieces. One, sharing with you just one individual's view of how you make a difference, of where I see Mexico in the world order today, and how all of you really make the difference in baby steps, right? Because we all sit here and we want somebody else to do it. And as I'm cycling ahead of you by 40 years or so, I used to have blonde hair and blue eyes. And you can see what this world of global investment has done to me. It's traumatic. But actually, what's going on in Mexico today is very similar to what's happened in many of the other industrialized countries. And we're gauged by confusion. So when we talk about quantitative easing, we'll come back and talk about that on really a global basis as to what's happening, where are the opportunities, how does Mexico fit into that scheme. It really comes back to basics. And the basics that I see around the world of what's changed is a simple change in a word. Most of the great countries of the world started with the idea and the concept of great families in deferred gratification. Working hard, loyalty, commitment, dedication, building for the future over time. And what happened in a decade is we converted deferred gratification into instant gratification. So when you think about it, I go around talking to my team. I have 5 kids from a couple of administrations. So I have problems in every decade, so I can relate to it crisply. And my youngest, my teenage boy, when I ask him really what he wants to do, he says, well, I want to be an investor. I said, no, but what do you want to do for a living? Investing is something that you do after you do the living. But what do you want to do for a living? He said, what do you mean I want to be an investor? So this era of so much information, because education is strange, and we have an educational issue all over the world, and you're confronting one in Mexico and doing a great job of it. And the hope of all of us is that the new momentum of this government is going to change a lot of the infrastructure. But everybody basically has the same amount of information. So on a business basis, if we sit down and we say, okay, what's our competitive edge? It's not information anymore, right? You tap Google, and the question that you want to answer can be answered in a nanosecond of what used to take 14 years of education to try and figure out. So it's not the information, it's the instinct. It's the training of year after year after year of those invisible, seamless, gracious, elegant acts that give you an instinct, a feeling about where and how to take risk. And all over the world, people talk about themes. Everybody's trying to take this information and say, I'm going to create a theme. And the way I'm going to invest is I'm going to define a theme. I'm going to define a business objective. It never existed in the world. The great families, and you have some of the most amazing families in Mexico, started out with a business, and that business led to opportunities, but the opportunities came by adapting. And this is historic 5,000 years ago. So the information and economists, which we're all paying attention to, have taken precedence, and it really has no bearing on anything. There's a cute story. I'm Lebanese, by descent, and I feel comfortable in Mexico because I know half of you have some Lebanese blood someplace in you. So I'm going to break out hummus and tabbouleh in a minute, and we'll celebrate. But I was with an uncle of mine in Beirut, very simple man, a countryman who has a flock of sheep. We're standing along the side of the road, and his flock is behind him, and up pulls a Bentley. Very well-dressed man in a Brioni suit hops out, looks at my uncle, and says, could I make a bet with you? Could I make a wager? My uncle says, sure, of course, what? He says, well, if I can guess how many sheep you have in your herd, will you pay me in kind with letting me have one of those animals? And if not, I'll give you $200. My uncle said, of course, it's impossible. You'll never be able to guess how many sheep. So the man took a look. He said, I think there's 257 sheep. My uncle, in astonishment, said, you're absolutely right. But how could you possibly have known that? He said, well, because I'm brilliant, I'm astute, I'm Harvard educated, I have all the pieces. He said, well, then take an animal. The man walks over, picks up an animal, goes back to his car. My uncle says, excuse me 1 second. Could we do double or nothing? The man says, sure. He says, if I guess what profession you're in, could I have the animal and the $200 back? The man says, yes, but it's impossible. Even though I'm brilliant, I'm charming, I'm handsome, I'm well-educated, it's probably impossible. My uncle says, well, you must be a government economist. The man says, that's unbelievable. How could you have ever guessed? That's exactly right. He said, because you picked up my dog, not a sheep. And this is it, right? Where we find opportunities is in the midst of what we do day to day for a living. And the deferred gratification of building those pieces, of understanding a business, of building long line commitments, of doing what you say, right? When I talk to young people in my own organization, and they have the most voracious appetite to say, what are the real clues to being successful? And it starts with the easiest of things, which is the most difficult of things, which is doing what you say, right? If you just do what you say, and you start making that a practice on a global basis, amazing things happen. And the definition of a theme is sometimes a hindrance. So all of you that are in businesses, and it's a fantastic time in Mexico, everything is disintermediated. The big banks no longer want to evaluate or take risk. The American banks and system is just starting to look at the real profile of Mexico. The government is changing, an energy policy is being implemented, the pension funds are starting to grow, the businesses are taking on international dimension. You have more engineers in Mexico than the Germans have in Germany, and everything is in front of you. So defining a theme, what is it going to be? How do we get there? What is it? Becomes the task. Well, my view of life after 40 years of doing this is it's the wrong thing to do. The right thing to do is to find the opportunity that swims around your feet. And many times we'll spend a lifetime after we've gone to the laboratory of intelligence crafting a theme, saying, I'm going to go into the world and I'm going to find this theme. And the problem is at that moment in time, the theme doesn't exist. So we're missing the opportunities that are going right under our feet every instant because our objective is to try and define that theme. So what I've found all over the world of instances like today for all of you where opportunity is huge, confusion is equally large, and we're all looking for a stance, for a posture. How do we benefit our society? How do we benefit our family? How do we grow? Where do we go? And it starts with those baby steps in what we do every day that turn into these long line relationships. And I wanted to share with you just a few of my own experiences that have gotten me into a series of businesses which seem totally unrelated. And by the way, they are unrelated because one thing leads to another, as it always does in life. And I started in life as a lawyer, and I come from a Lebanese family. My dad was a simple grocer, and my stimulus to education was, he said, if you don't become a doctor or a lawyer, I'm going to leave you this grocery store and you're going to be selling oranges. I said, thanks, Dad. I'll go get a great education. So I came out of law school scared to death because I looked around me and I said, there's only one problem. Everybody in this law firm that I'm now working is smarter than me. So what's my competitive edge? What am I going to do? Because for sure they're smarter. So I'm not going to outthink them. I'm not going to outwork them. So I decided the only thing that I could do is take more risk than they're taking. And the calibration of risk for all of us is really the biggest decision in our life. The risk with the mate that we choose, the risk with the children that we're raising, the risk in every day of the choices that we make, and all of those things. And what I learned as a young man sitting in a law office was I had to go to the edge quicker, sooner, and the only safe way to do that was to be more prepared. So one day I was sitting in the office on a Saturday morning, and the senior partner walked in. I was then 23 years old, sitting in downtown Los Angeles, working for a great law firm. I was so happy. And the senior partner worked in the law firm and looked at me. In those days, I had black curly hair and, of course, was darker than most people that were there. And he said, aren't you Lebanese? And, of course, at that time, they thought Lebanese was a sexual preference. They had no idea that it was a nationality. I said, yes, sir, I am. He says, well, do you know anything about gas liquefaction plants? I said, it's amazing you asked because I happen to be an expert in gas liquefaction plants. Of course, I had no idea what a gas liquefaction plant was. He said, great, I'm going to send you to Saudi Arabia on Saturday. We represent Bechtel, and we're doing a gas liquefaction plant. I want to send you over to do I was a finance lawyer. Now, finance lawyer, today finance is in. I can tell you at the time that I was a finance lawyer, nobody could spell finance, right? All of the smart guys were going to Procter & Gamble, Caterpillar Tractor. It was a different era. Boom, off I get shipped to Saudi Arabia, my mother in tears, saying, I don't understand this. We spent a lifetime escaping that part of the world. Now you're going back to that part of the world. What's going on? And I have to tell you, as I was sitting in Riyadh on some of those Saturday and Sundays, saying, oh my God, what have I done? It was desolate in those days. So part of the secret to my success, and I'm going to share it with you now, I really haven't shared it with too many people, was my ability to play squash. Was not my intellect, was not my hard work. It was an accident. So I'm sitting in the middle of a compound, which is Aramco, and in walks my boss one day and says, do you play squash? I said, yeah, I do. He said, well, I want you to go play squash this afternoon at 4 o'clock with this young man. He'll meet you. I said, great. I went and I met this young Saudi boy. I had no idea who he was. We played squash. He said, well, can you meet me again tomorrow? This started about a 3-week progression of playing squash. By luck, it ended up being one of the sons of the king. Of course, there were only 37 sons of the king at that time. And soon he went to my boss and said, this kid is really brilliant. Can I take him with me? Of course, I was really brilliant because I was the only guy in the compound who could play squash. So he took me with him, and then my life started in earnest. It wasn't my intellect. It wasn't my ability. It wasn't information that I had. It was I could suffer more pain than the next guy. I was willing to do something they were not willing to do. I was willing to go someplace they didn't want to go. And that continued in my life to be the key to finding these nodes of opportunity. So later in life, where are we in Mexico today? It reminds me of where we were in the 70s and the 80s in the US. So you have a number of things happening. You have, in the 70s and 80s in the US, you had government intervention of all sorts. So inflation starts running rampant in the 70s. The banking regulations changed in 1982. There was a thing called the Garn-Saint-Germain Act, which changed savings and loans and allowed them to start lending not just to single-family housing companies, but to all sorts of companies. And the rest was then the collapse in 1990 of the savings and loan industry and government intervention. So government intervention in 1990, government intervention again in 1997, which is an analogous time to right now in Mexico. In 1980, there were securities firms in the US, so there were firms that were selling shares. Mexico has a rather tiny stock market for the size of the country. It's growing. Why does it grow? It'll grow because pension funds are getting better organized. The laws are changing. Transparency is entering. But underneath it, what is it? Underneath it is you have the best entrepreneurs in the world. And Mexican entrepreneurs and Mexican workers for hundreds of years have been surviving without governmental intervention. So now we're at a switch where we say, really what we want is we want government intervention to make it easier for us. It's not going to happen. You're going to make it happen. And in the 70s and 80s in the US, it was very, very similar. So at that moment, the securities industry was built by people who were just selling shares, not by banks. Then in 1997, Glass-Steagall, which was a law that said the banks and the securities firms cannot do the same thing, changed. And so banks could then finance and sell securities. This begat the real era of investment banking. And investment banking then took on a whole new focus, which was to create derivative instruments that could be sold all over the world. Now, Mexico is 30 years back in creating this tier of investment climate, but you're starting with the best of class. You now have some great investment bankers who are starting to fill that gap. You have Banamex and others who are global banks of best of class. You have entrepreneurs, you have an energy program, you have a working class that's par excellence, but it's confusing, right? The globe is confusing. You have quantitative easing, there's too much money in the world, nobody knows where exactly to invest. The pension funds are starting to invest more aggressively, but we need infrastructure. So we talk about transparency, a legal system, a tax system, infrastructure for highways, roads, bridges, all these things that you can't control. But at the end of the day, as I wander around the world looking for value, because my mission from my investor base is to find extraordinary returns, not ordinary returns, and try and do that taking ordinary risk. And the only competitive advantage is to go back to those basics of looking at the resources that you have in front of you today and say, I'm going to change it one baby step at a time. I'm going to change it through gauging and calibrating my risk. So if we started out as whether we're a private equity firm as Colony or real estate firm, I'm not sure. But we started out looking and saying, okay, in order to understand real estate, you have to understand the businesses that are using real estate. So the first owners of real estate were always the industrialists, the merchants, the businesses that use real estate, and they understood the elements of that better. So we started then going to the inefficient frontier of saying, we will go to the operating companies that own real estate rather than buying real estate, and we'll arbitrage those operating companies rather than the real estate itself. And sometimes Main Street was better, sometimes Wall Street was better. And you have this virtuous and vicious cycle that happens all over the world. So what happens is real estate booms around the world. Banks come in and lend against real estate. Banks go bust. Entrepreneurs come in and buy those assets from the banks that went bust. Banks sells and consolidate. Then the promotion of new conservative lending starts. Then real estate operating recaps start. Then everybody overlends, the banks bust again, and it starts all over again, right? That's the circle of how the real estate world works. So the key ingredients are to turn left when everybody's turning right and turn right when they're turning left. That risk profile is about getting out of the pack, not in the pack. So if we were to sit here and the secretary were to give you the secret magic elixir of the 5 events that are going to happen in this next year, and all of you had certainty about what was going to happen, you'd all be getting ordinary returns. You would all be in the same pack. You would all be operating on exactly the same information. So in a sense, the moment of not having that information, of finding a contrarian theme, of having an industrial base in a country that's growing, that's blowing, that's expanding, that a generation of all of you who's questioning, who wants, is the opportunity of a lifetime. And the reason we and other American institutions are coming here is we see it. And sometimes we see it with the humility of knowing we have no idea. We don't have the hubris to think that we can come to Mexico and do anything better than the Mexicans can. But we're looking with a global magnifying glass and looking at what you have. And the main ingredient starts with the Mexican people itself. You have the largest consuming country in the world on your boundary. The main language in the United States is Spanish. The transition of that border and that boundary can only be defined by what's in your own minds, right? This ability for us to leverage those pieces all happens when it's time, and it's time for it to happen now. So while the world is hunting for returns, it's hunting for inefficiency. You have inefficiency in front of you. And I think in just baby steps of the things that you can do yourself, not that the government can do for you, you're going to make quantum leaps in the next 20 years, just like the U.S. did from 1975 to 2006. And Hank Paulson will tell you what happened in 2007 and what that hubris was that we created in our own system. And in my opinion, it was very simple, is we went from the best things that we had, which was individuals building businesses, individuals working for their family, from loyalty, dedication, commitment, to being an investor society. And when we created those weapons, those instruments of mass destruction, and everybody thought they were going to make more money by investing than they were for working for a living, we got in trouble. So I'm going to go to questions. I'm going to leave you just with a few rules that I have kind of gathered over time, which seem very elementary. And if I can tell any of you who are 40 and under that are in this room, I promise you, if you abided by half of these rules, you will be so amazingly successful, right? Do it now. The idea of procrastination exists all over the world, and the ability and the gift of people to actually do what they say and do it now is amazing. You know, punctuality is the courtesy of kings. I never understood. My mother used to tell me that every day. By showing up on time or 5 minutes early is the greatest gift that you can give the other person. You can be the smartest. You can be the most elegant. And if you show up 5 minutes late in any culture, even the Arab culture, which I grew up in, it's telling the other person, I think that my time is more important than yours. So going back to what we talked about in this deferred gratification versus instant gratification, all of these little things, holding doors, paying attention to the little people. I can't tell you how many deals and transactions that I have gotten from a doorman, from a waitress, from a driver who overheard a conversation, from somebody that I just paid some insignificant attention to at a moment where they needed it. And most importantly, at the end of the day, you just show up. When in doubt, show up. Volunteer for everything, do everything, and that opportunity will come to you over time. So I've given you a handout to show you that it wasn't a wasted effort on all the technical information that maybe many of you would like to go through, and I'm happy now to take a few minutes and go through the business aspects of where we see the world, if you'd like to do that. And thanks for your time and attention.
Y tenemos unos minutos para un par de preguntas, si alguien tiene por favor interés.
Hello, Mr. Barrack. Rosana Fuentes from Grupo Expansión. I'm looking at your vicious virtuous circle of real estate, and you seem to think that we are on the euphoria, between the greed and the euphoria, and I think we're a little bit behind. You also put here doubt, disgust, this year has been a tough year for most of us. I don't know in the audience if that is shared, but especially for those in the real estate sphere. And banks are not forthcoming lending money. It's very hard to get money for real estate in Mexico. Can you share with us one of these snippets of wisdom that you have to get us into the wishing, hoping, or the euphoria stage? Because I think most of the Mexicans I talked to, at least in this year, are not in an euphoria mood at all.
No, it's a great question. I wish I had a pill for all of us to get us to euphoria quickly. But if you look at other cycles, right? Because this cycle works almost in every country, and it just continues around the world. The best returns to you as an investor should be in the moments where there's the least amount of liquidity, right? Real estate is about supply and demand. It's about supply and demand of two things. It's about supply and demand of product. So we have users, retail tenants, office tenants, hotels who need space. And most importantly for all of us, it's about supply and demand of capital. So banks traditionally have been the provider of capital, and when they withdraw, we all withdraw, because why be an investor in real estate? And we have a slide, David, if you can get to the slide of the leverage ability of being able to borrow, of tax advantages, of diversity from other investments, have mostly been driven in other communities and societies either by capital preservation, so in Europe, patrimony, after decades and decades of wealth, or pension funds. So in America, what created the liquidity in the real estate business? In 1990, by the way, there were no REITs. So you're just starting the REIT formula, and it's a difficult place to climb, because you want transparency, you want liquidity, you want a readily available market, and that's not easy to provide, especially when you don't have an institutional base of buyers. So in 1990 in the US, just to give you an example, the RTC had just been formed. There were 550 billion of terrible assets. The real estate market was flat. There wasn't a dollar from pension funds, and there was not a dollar from banks to be lent into that market. By 1994, by the way, when I look back and people say, what mistakes did you make in 1990? The mistakes we made in 1990 was to not buy everything. We should have bought everything. At the darkest hour, we should have bought everything. But we analyzed and we analyzed and we worried and we sweated. By 1994, REITs had just started. So from zero, literally zero REITs, in 1994, all of those problems had been reorganized. And by 1994, we had 150, 200 billion of REITs that came out of that crisis. Why was that formed? Because Wall Street got behind it. And Wall Street got behind it because they created a product that the pension funds would buy. So all of a sudden you had a security that had these things that never existed before: real yield, called AFFO, transparency, governance, all of these things that didn't exist in real estate. So the idea of trying to garner capital has to be hand in glove. Banks, investment banks, individual entrepreneurs, and Mexico is even more complicated, because you've got a very complicated entitlement process. You have a lot of cash that's moving through the system that's not institutional, and the supply demand is somewhat questionable. But I would say you'll probably look back, and if you could garner capital during this period, it would be the best investable moment, because there's the least liquidity in the market at the moment. And it will happen, right? It has to happen. If you look at pension fund reform has to start with these pension funds investing more in their own communities. As I recall the numbers, I think there's more foreign investment of your pension fund system in foreign equities than there are in domestic equities. So as it gauges itself and gets a balance, it will come back. But it is a vicious circle, and when there's no capital, everything stops, but then it becomes more dear. Then demand increases and supply decreases, and those who can garner the capital will do better. And when that happens, then the banks will jump on the bandwagon at the wrong time. They'll overlend into the market, and we start over again. Thanks.
Anyone else? Por allá.
Hello, Mr. Barrack. Thank you for sharing with us. I guess this is a related question, and I'd like to get your perspective on local REITs, because for the players that are in the real estate market but aren't inside REITs, it feels like a perverse game of monopoly where you're getting paid to buy the hotels in every property instead of paying for the hotels. And there's a lot of euphoria. Have you seen this in the US in the 90s or in another market where people are buying indiscriminately, and what was the result of that, and how would you play this market?
It's a great question. I'll give you the view of the U.S., Japan, and France, which are kind of the three major markets. So in the U.S., as I said, in 1990 there was no REIT market, and when it started, everybody was suspect, because to buy a piece of paper from a management entity for replicatable earnings on this complicated set of real estate issues was difficult to understand. And what happened by 1999, analysts, so pension funds came in. We all, by the way, started with defined benefit and defined contribution plans, right? So defined contribution was the only method as it is here, and we've rolled to defined benefit. But the real estate entrepreneurs were just that, real estate entrepreneurs. They weren't professional managers in the US. So the first phase of doubt was, for the first 4 years, everybody looked and said, we're being ripped off. They're taking their garbage and their junk. They just bought all this stuff back from the banks. They're putting it into these securitized pieces. We're getting what I call the cappuccino layer of return, and they're getting the espresso. And we can't tell which is which, because the analytical set of transparency that was involved in REITs was not available. And people looked and said, what's the value for me to invest in REITs? And in the US, it was liquidity. So there was a liquidity premium of institutions saying, I'd rather own a REIT than own the office building. Why? Because I can trade away those shares. And over the years, you've seen what happened. The covariance between REIT stocks and the S&P 500 is actually about the same today. They used to think that it was different. So it takes time. It takes time for professional managers to gain transparency in those markets. And side by side, the pension funds have really got to take the lead in defining those metrics of what it is that they're looking at. And again, REITs only work when there's income. NAV, net asset value, against REIT shares takes analytical work. Very difficult to do in a community where you don't have information available, and it's very difficult here. Really, really difficult. So you don't have a consolidation of information to have an analytical base. You don't have all the rules in place yet to give it transparency. But it will happen, and it'll happen primarily from the pension fund saying, the first thing we want to digest is real estate securities product. Then we'll go to alternative assets. They're going to have to go to alternative assets. You know, private equity, as I recall, the limitation for your pension funds to invest in private equity or alternative assets are companies with 50 billion or more in assets. So what that does is makes it impossible for all of you to be in the private equity or alternative asset business. So where does the money go? It goes to BlackRock, right? It goes outside of the country. So the main thing is pension fund reform. If you get the pension funds to reform and allow these little enclaves of local players to be bred, to follow, to breed, to create REIT funds, to have alternative asset alternatives, it will start, but it takes time. By the way, it was the same in Japan. So the J REITs in Japan, exactly the same issue. And it ebbs and flows. There's times where, for instance, a year and a half ago, the best trade was buying the J REITs and taking them private. The arbitrage was the assets were worth more than the shares. Now we're back to where the shares are worth more than the assets.
¿Tenemos más preguntas? Bueno, pues al parecer estamos ya listos. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much, Mr. Barrack.